The 13th lash landed with a sound like a wet rope slapping a side of beef. It was a sound Calb Mercer would never forget, a final brutal punctuation to the town's judgment. He felt the skin on his back split, a fresh line of fire drawn across a canvas of old scars. His knees, already trembling, gave way completely, and he fell forward into the dust of Hollow Creek's main street. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, beating down on his bare back, baking the blood and sweat into a crust of agony. He tasted grit and iron. The jeering faces of the crowd swam in his vision, blurring into a single, hateful organism. Men who had once shared a drink with him, women who had nodded politely in the street, now watched his humiliation with a morbid satisfaction. They had pronounced him barren, a man cursed by God, an empty vessel not fit to carry on a name. It was a lie, a cruel excuse born of a failed marriage, and his own desperate, foolish claim of a child that never was. But it was a lie the town had chosen to believe. It was easier than admitting their own hardships were simply the whims of a harsh land. He refused to cry out. He had made a promise to himself as they tied his wrists to the whipping post. He would not give them the satisfaction of his screams. He would swallow the pain, let it burn him from the inside out. But his voice would remain his own. He pressed his face into the dirt, his body a single throbbing nerve. The world began to gray at the edges. Through the haze of his failing consciousness, a pair of polished boots entered his field of vision. They stopped just inches from his head. Calb forced his eyes to travel upward, past the fine wool trousers, to the silver-buckled belt, up the tailored vest, to the cold, triumphant face of Wendell Crow. Crow was a man who had arrived in Hollow Creek with money and ambition. A man who moved with the predatory grace of someone who believed the world was his for the taking. He had orchestrated this, Calb knew. Crow had fanned the flames of rumor, used his influence with the judge, and turned the town's simmering resentment into this public spectacle. Crow knelt, his movements precise and unhurried. The crowd quieted, sensing a final, more personal act in this theater of cruelty. Crow's fingers, surprisingly delicate, reached for Calb's neck. They closed around the thin leather cord he always wore. With a sharp tug, the cord snapped. No, Calb rasped the word, a dry, broken thing. Crow held up his prize, a small silver locket tarnished with age and sweat. It swung gently from his fingers, catching the brutal sunlight. Crow's thumb flicked open the clasp, revealing the miniature hand-painted portrait inside. A woman with kind eyes and a smile that held a hint of sorrow. Eleanor, Calb's first wife. Crow's gaze was ice. He looked from the portrait to Calb's broken form in the dust, a flicker of something deeper than greed in his eyes. It was hatred, pure and personal. She was my sister Crow, said his voice, a low, venomous whisper meant only for Calb. You don't deserve to carry her memory. He snapped the locket shut and pocketed it. The word struck Calb with more force than any lash. Sister. Eleanor had never spoken of a brother. The world tilted, the pain in his back forgotten, replaced by a cold, numbing confusion. Crow stood, cast one last look of utter contempt at Calb, and turned to walk away. The finality of the act, the theft of the one sacred thing he had left, was the blow that finally broke him. The gray at the edges of his vision consumed everything. Then Calb Mercer collapsed into the waiting darkness. He woke to the scent of soap and dried lilac, and the gentle pressure of a cool, damp cloth against his brow. The searing pain in his back had dulled to a deep, throbbing ache. He was no longer in the sun-scorched street, but in the shade, his head resting on something soft. He blinked, his vision clearing slowly. A woman knelt beside him, her focus entirely on cleaning the grime from his face. Her dress was simple, a faded calico brown, her hands calloused, but her touch surprisingly gentle. Behind her, 3 children stood clustered together, like a small flock of quail watching him with wide, solemn eyes. A boy no older than 9 held himself stiffly, his expression a mixture of suspicion and pity. A slightly younger girl with a cascade of tangled brown hair clutched the woman's skirt, while the youngest, a little girl with round cheeks, held a worn, button-eyed doll. He tried to speak, but his throat was a desert. "Who?" The woman looked up. Her face was plain, but possessed a quiet strength, her eyes the color of the earth after a spring rain. They held no judgment, only a strange, resolute calm. "My name's Miriam," she said, her voice steady. "These are my children, Levi, Ruthie, and Nana." She dipped the cloth into a wooden bucket beside her. "Don't try to move. You'll only open the wounds again." The town was gone. The jeering crowd, the smug deputy, the silent preacher, all had retreated behind their closed doors. As Miriam worked, Kalb could see the flicker of curtains in nearby windows, the shadows of figures quickly turning away. Hollow Creek had performed its ritual of purification and now wanted nothing to do with the evidence. They had cast him out, and now they were ashamed to witness the one act of mercy being shown. Why, he managed to ask, his voice a raw whisper. Miriam met his gaze directly. The firmness in her eyes was more solid than any chain. "Because you need a place to heal," she said, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. "And because I need a husband." The words stunned him into silence. He stared at her, certain the heat and pain had finally broken his mind. He tried to push himself up, a protest forming on his cracked lips, but a wave of agony shot through his back, and he collapsed with a choked grunt. "You're not walking," she stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Her gaze shifted to her son, Levi the wagon. The boy nodded once and darted away, returning moments later, leading a sturdy, if-weathered horse hitched to a simple buckboard wagon. The journey from the street to the wagon was a blur of grinding pain. For Kalb, Miriam, with a strength that belied her slender frame, took most of his weight, her arm firmly around his chest. Levi pushed from behind, his small hands surprisingly strong. They settled him onto a bed of straw and old quilts in the back of the wagon. As Miriam snapped the reins, the wagon rumbled into motion, its wheels leaving the oppressive dust of Hollow Creek behind. The town receded, a collection of false fronts and fearful silence. No one came out to stop them. Preacher Malcolm, who had turned his face away during the whipping, now stood at the chapel door, his head bowed, not in prayer, but in what looked like profound shame. He made no move to help. The wagon climbed out of the dusty plains, and the air slowly changing. The scent of pine began to replace the smell of dust and despair. The oppressive heat lessened as they entered a rolling landscape of wooded hills. Red sand glowing under the sun gave way to the cooler, shaded earth. The rumble of the wheels was a constant lulling rhythm, and the world began to feel soft at the edges again. "Stay awake if you can," Miriam said over her shoulder. "We have a ways to go." He gritted his teeth against a fresh wave of pain. "I can't give you children." The words came out bitter, the town's curse still clinging to him. Miriam didn't turn around. Her voice was carried back on the gentle breeze. "I'm not asking for more," she replied. "Just for someone who won't give up on the ones I already have." He fell silent, the simple sincerity of her words disarming him. He must have drifted off, because the next thing he knew, the wagon had stopped. A small, sturdy cabin stood nestled in a clearing, smoke curling from its stone chimney. It leaned slightly, as if tired, but it looked solid, rooted to the earth. Miriam's homestead was a world away from Hollow Creek. It was a place of quiet order and relentless work. Over the next few days, Kalb drifted in and out of a painful haze, while Miriam and her children tended to him. She cleaned his wounds with an herbal salve that smelled of yarrow and pine, her touch always firm and professional. Levi remained wary. The boy watched Kalb with an unblinking stare, his posture protective whenever Kalb was near his mother or sisters. He spoke little, but his actions were loud. He chopped wood with a ferocity that seemed too big for his small frame, and always made sure the water bucket by Kalb's cot was full. Ruthie was the family's quiet heart. She moved with a gentle grace, humming tuneless songs as she helped her mother with chores. One afternoon, as Kalb lay staring at the ceiling trying to ignore the fire in his back, she approached his cot and silently placed a single perfect wildflower on the blanket beside his hand before scurrying away. Little Nena, barely 4 years old, was pure, unfiltered curiosity. After 2 days of watching him from a safe distance, she toddled over her worn doll clutched in one hand and simply stared at him, her round eyes taking in his bruised face and bandaged torso. Then, with the solemnity of a diplomat presenting a gift, she held the doll out to him. He took it with a trembling hand, and she rewarded him with a wide, toothy grin. Slowly, the days pieced themselves together into a routine of healing. Kalb began to sit up then, to stand each movement a victory hard won against the pain. He started taking his meals at the small wooden table with the family. The silence was often thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who understood that some things didn't need words. One evening, as the sun set, casting long golden shadows across the cabin floor, Levi was struggling to carve a piece of wood with a dull knife. He was trying to make a small bird, but his frustration was getting the better of him. "You're holding the blade wrong," Kalb said, his voice still rough from disuse. Levi's head snapped up, his jaw tight with defensive pride. "I know what I'm doing." "You'll cut yourself that way," Kalb said gently. "Let the wood tell you where to cut. Don't force it. Here." He slowly got up from his chair, wincing as he moved, and knelt beside the boy. He didn't take the knife, but simply guided Levi's hands with his own. "Angle it like this. Shorter strokes. See?" Under his guidance, a smooth, elegant curl of wood peeled away. Levi stared at it, then at Kalb. The suspicion in the boy's eyes softened, replaced by a flicker of grudging respect. He didn't say thank you, but he adjusted his grip and continued to carve his movements, now more confident, more patient. Later that night, after the younger girls were asleep, Ruthie sat by the hearth, softly singing a folk song Kalb had never heard before. It was a mournful ballad about a sailor lost at sea, his lover waiting on a shore he would never reach again. The simple, heartbreaking melody resonated with the grief Kalb still carried for Eleanor, a grief now twisted by Crow's revelation. He closed his eyes, the girl's song a balm on a wound he thought had long since scarred over. He was a stranger here, a broken man taken in by a family that had every reason to fear outsiders. Yet in their quiet, unassuming way, they were offering him something he hadn't realized he'd lost a place to belong. And that possibility terrified him more than any whip ever could. A month passed. The raw wounds on Kalb's back healed into a tight, angry network of scars. His strength returned, slowly fueled by Miriam's simple, nourishing meals and the steady rhythm of homestead chores. He repaired the leaky barn roof, reinforced a sagging fence line, and taught Levi how to properly set a snare. He was becoming a part of the family's life, a fixture as solid and quiet as the ancient oak tree that shaded the cabin. He and Miriam had not spoken again of her proposal, but an unspoken understanding grew between them. They were partners in this small, isolated world, allies against the harshness that lay just beyond the trees. The past arrived on a blistering hot afternoon, riding a sweat-soaked horse and wearing the familiar badge of Hollow Creek's law. Deputy Rusk reined in his mount at the edge of the clearing, his presence an immediate violation of the homestead's peace. He sat in his saddle with a lazy slouch, a smirk playing on his lips as he surveyed the scene. Kalb splitting wood, Miriam hanging laundry, the children playing near the creek. "Well now," Rusk called out, his voice a sly, mocking drawl that grated on Kalb's nerves. "Looks like the dead have risen." Kalb set the axe down slowly, his body tensing. He moved to stand between Rusk and his new family. "You're not welcome here, Rusk." Just delivering a message, Rusk said, swinging a leg over his saddle and dismounting. He moved with a swagger, a man enjoying the weight of his borrowed power. Orders from Judge Patterson. Seems your new missus has some outstanding debts. Miriam walked over, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression calm, but her eyes wary. My husband Joseph's debts were settled. Rusk chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. Not according to Wendell Crow. He bought the paper on your late husband's loans. Says you owe him a considerable sum. And now that you've taken on a new husband, he said, his gaze lingering on Kalb, that debt falls to him. He pulled a folded document from his coat. This makes it official. You've got 30 days to pay, or Crow takes the land. Kalb knew it was a lie. This had nothing to do with debt and everything to do with Crow. This is just another whipping, isn't it? Kalb said, his voice low. A different kind of whip. Rusk's smirk widened. Crow never forgets a debt, especially one he feels is paid in blood. The words were a clear, pointed reference, a glint of shared knowledge in the deputy's eyes. He was taunting Kalb, letting him know this was all part of Crow's larger, unseen plan. We have no money, Miriam said, her voice firm, betraying no fear. Rusk's eyes flickered toward the cabin, where Ruthie and Nana were now watching from the window, their small faces pressed against the glass. His voice dropped, becoming silky and menacing. It's a fine family you've got here, ma'am. A real shame to see it uprooted. Winter's coming, a hard thing to face without a roof over your head. The veiled threat was unmistakable. This wasn't just about land. It was about destroying this fragile piece, this new life Kalb was building. It was about taking everything from him, just as Crow believed Kalb had taken everything from him. Get off this land, Kalb said, stepping forward. His hands were empty, but his stance was a clear warning. Just the messenger, Rusk said, raising his hands in mock surrender. He backed away slowly toward his horse. 30 days, Mercer. The clock is ticking. He mounted up, gave a final insolent tip of his hat, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence in his wake. Miriam turned to Kalb, her face pale but her resolve unbroken. He's lying. I know, Kalb said, his gaze fixed on the trail where Rusk had disappeared. The debt was a fiction, a legal weapon forged by Crow and sanctioned by a corrupt judge. But the threat was real. Crow wasn't just coming for the land. He was coming for him. And he would use this family, this haven of grace, to break him completely. The deputy's visit left a poison in the air. The peace of the homestead was shattered, replaced by a tense, watchful quiet. Kalb saw the fear in Miriam's eyes, though she tried to hide it behind a facade of relentless work. He saw it in the way Levi stuck closer to the cabin, his whittling knife replaced by the small rifle Kalb had been teaching him to use. The threat wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a promise of violence. Kalb knew paying the fraudulent debt was not an option. It would be an admission of guilt, and Crow would only invent another larger debt. Fighting was also a losing proposition. Crow had the law, the money, and the men. To win, Kalb had to understand why. Why this elaborate, cruel charade, Crow's words at the whipping post. She was my sister, echoed in his mind. It was the key, but he didn't know which door it unlocked. He had to unravel the lie from its beginning. I have to go, he told Miriam 2 nights later as they sat by the dwindling fire. The children were asleep, and the cabin was filled with the soft sounds of the night. Go where, she asked, her hand stilling in her lap, where she was mending one of Levi's shirts. To Ridgeburg. There's a man there, a retired county clerk named Elias Thorne. I knew him years ago. He's honest, and he remembers everything. If Crow and Judge Patterson fabricated this debt, there might be a record, something out of place. I need to know what the official story is. He paused, his next words heavy. And I need to know about Eleanor. About her death. Miriam looked at him, her expression searching. She knew he was holding something back, a piece of his past that was still a raw, open wound. It's a 2-day ride. I'll have to be careful, he said. If Crow's men see me, they'll know I'm looking for answers. She nodded slowly. When will you leave? Before dawn. She finished her stitch, tied off the thread, and set the shirt aside. She rose and came to him, placing her hands on his shoulders. Come back, Calb, she said, her voice a soft plea. It wasn't a command or a demand. It was a statement of faith. He left in the pre-dawn darkness, riding the old mule, his hat pulled low. The journey was fraught with tension. Every rider he saw in the distance sent a jolt of alarm through him. He skirted the main roads, sticking to wooded trails, his senses on high alert. He was no longer just Calb Mercer, the homesteader. He was a man moving through enemy territory, a ghost from a past that he was desperately trying to understand. Ridgeburg was a dusty, wind-blown town, smaller and less prosperous than Hollow Creek. He found Elias Thorne living in a small room above the town's only boarding house. The old man was frail, his hands spotted with age, but his eyes were as sharp and clear as they had been a decade ago. Calb Mercer. Elias set a flicker of surprise on his face as he opened the door. I heard they ran you out of Hollow Creek. Heard it was ugly. It was, Calb said simply. I need your help, Elias. I need you to look back at some records for me. Unofficially. He explained the situation with Crow and the fraudulent debt. Elias listened intently, stroking his thin white beard. When Calb finished, the old clerk let out a long sigh. Wendell Crow. Elias murmured. He arrived in Hollow Creek about a month after your wife. After Eleanor passed. A quiet man at first. Started buying up small parcels of land, offering loans. Before anyone knew it, he had his hooks in half the county. Judge Patterson included. Calb's blood ran cold. A month after she died, Elias nodded. It gets stranger. I was still with the county then. I remember when the report on your wife's accident came through. A carriage overturned during that big storm, wasn't it? Yes, Calb said, the memory still vivid and painful. The lashing rain, the scream of the wind, the sickening crunch of wood and bone. Well? Elias continued, lowering his voice. The very next day, Judge Patterson himself came down to the records office. He took the official file on the incident, the doctor's report, the sheriff's summary, everything. Said it was part of a sensitive family matter and sealed it by court order. I never saw it again. I never. Calb stared at him, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. He sealed it. Why? I don't know. But for a judge to personally intervene and seal the records on a simple accident? It's unheard of. It means there was something in that file he didn't want anyone to see, or something he wanted to make sure no one could ever question. Elias leaned forward, his eyes grave. Crow arrives a few weeks later, and the two of them become thick as thieves. Whatever this is about, Calb, it's not about land. It's about your wife. And Crow and Patterson have gone to great lengths to bury the truth of how she died. Calb left Elias's room with a heavy heart, but a clear purpose. The debt was a pretext. The whipping was a public shaming. This was all a slow, methodical destruction, and it was rooted in the worst night of his life. To save his new family, he would have to dig up the ghosts of his old one. Returning to the homestead, Calb was struck by how much it had become his anchor. The sight of the cabin with smoke curling from its chimney settled a part of his soul that had been restless for years. But the information from Elias cast a long, dark shadow over that peace. This was a conspiracy deeper and more personal than he had imagined. Crow wasn't just a predator. He was a hunter, and Calb was his prey. He shared what he learned with Miriam. He sat her down at the kitchen table and told her everything about Crow's timely arrival, about Judge Patterson sealing the records of Eleanor's death. He watched her face as he spoke, saw her absorb the gravity of the situation. She didn't flinch. Then we're trapped, she said, her voice quiet but firm. They control the law. For now, Calb said. But they've made a mistake. They think I'm a broken man who will run. They don't know I have something to fight for. In the weeks that followed, Crow's pressure intensified. It was no longer overt, but a slow, insidious strangulation. When Miriam sent Levi into town for flour and salt, the general store owner, a man she had traded with for years, suddenly claimed he was out of stock, his eyes refusing to meet the boys. The next week, the blacksmith who had promised to forge a new plow blade for Kalb lost the order. Men with cold eyes and guns on their hips began to appear at the edge of the property, not trespassing, but just watching. They were isolating the family, cutting them off from the world, making their small homestead an island in a hostile sea. The constant pressure took its toll, but it also forged a deeper bond between Kalb and Miriam. They were forced to rely on each other completely, their days a silent partnership of work and watchfulness. They found strength in shared glances across the dinner table, in the brief touch of hands as they passed in the narrow cabin hallway. One night, a storm rolled in, and the thunder rattling the windows and the wind howling like a hungry wolf. The children were huddled together, frightened by the tempest's fury. The storm's violence seemed to mirror the turmoil in Kalb's own heart. As Miriam soothed Nana back to sleep, Kalb stood by the window, staring out into the lashing rain. "It was a night like this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Miriam came to stand beside him. The accident. He nodded, the confession he had held inside for years, finally breaking free. Eleanor wanted to go to Ridgeburg to see her aunt. "I told her the storm was coming, that the roads would be treacherous. The axle on the carriage was old, and I worried it wouldn't hold." He swallowed the memory raw. But she was insistent, stubborn. She said I was being overcautious. We argued. I didn't want her to go, but I didn't want to fight anymore. So I gave in. I drove the carriage. He turned from the window, his face etched with a guilt that time had not eased. The axle snapped on the ridge road. The carriage went over the embankment. I woke up in the mud with a broken arm. She was gone. I've carried it ever since Miriam. The knowledge that if I had been stronger, if I had just said no, she would still be alive. I've always blamed myself. Miriam listened, her expression filled with a profound empathy. When he finished, she took his hand. It was trembling. "My Joseph," she said softly, "he died of a fever. For a year, after all I could think about were the things I could have done differently. Should I have sent for the doctor sooner? Should I have tried a different remedy? Grief makes us look for reasons, Kalb. It makes us look for someone to blame. And it's always easiest to blame ourselves." She squeezed his hand. "You loved her. You tried to protect her. You cannot carry the weight of her choices." Her words were a release, a small measure of grace in the storm-tossed darkness. In that moment, their bond was sealed. They were no longer just a man and a woman united by circumstance. They were two souls who understood the landscape of loss, two people who had found in each other a place to finally lay down their burdens. He pulled her into his arms, and they stood together, listening to the storm, no longer just partners in survival, but partners in healing. The attack came a week later under the cover of another violent storm. The rain fell in blinding sheets, turning the homestead into a world of mud and roaring wind. It was the perfect cover. Kalb was securing the animals in the barn when he heard a sound that wasn't thunder. It was the splintering of wood. The front gate. He grabbed a pitchfork, his heart pounding. Through the barn's open door, he saw them, a half-dozen riders, their forms dark silhouettes against the lightning-streaked sky. They were moving on the cabin. This wasn't harassment anymore. Inside, Miriam had already acted. He saw the flicker of her lantern as she herded the children toward the hidden root cellar. Brave, practical Miriam. Levy, holding the small rifle, stood by the door, his face pale but resolute. Two of the men broke off, heading for the barn. Kalb ducked behind a stack of hay bales as they entered, their boots sloshing in the mud on the floor. "He's in here somewhere," one of them grunted. Crow wants him alive. Alive. That was the detail that chilled Kalb to the bone. They weren't here to burn them out. They were here for him. He waited until they passed and then lunged. He drove the pitchfork into the first man's leg, eliciting a howl of pain. He swung the heavy wooden handle like a club, catching the second man across the jaw. The man staggered back, stunned, giving Kalb the precious seconds he needed to scramble up the ladder to the hayloft. From below, a new voice cut through the chaos. "Forget the others. Just bring me Mercer." It was Crow. He stood in the barn doorway, soaked by the rain, his face a mask of cold fury. He held a revolver in his hand, its barrel glinting in the lantern light. He watched as Kalb disappeared into the shadows of the loft. "There's no use hiding, Kalb," Crow shouted over the storm. "This has been a long time coming." Kalb crept through the hay, his mind racing. He needed a weapon, an advantage. His eyes landed on a heavy block and tackle hanging from the main beam. An idea, desperate and dangerous, formed in his mind. Crow grew impatient. He fired a shot into the ceiling of the loft, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Splinters rained down. "I know you're up there. Face me like a man." Kalb knew he had to draw him out. He deliberately kicked a loose board, sending it clattering to the floor on the far side of the loft. Crow took the bait. He moved deeper into the barn, his eyes scanning the darkness above his gun raised. He stepped directly under the heavy pulley. Now, Kalb threw his weight against the release rope. The heavy iron block plummeted downward. Crow heard the whistle of its descent and tried to leap back, but he was too slow. The block smashed into his shoulder, not with enough force to kill, but enough to send him crashing to the barn floor. His revolver flew from his grasp, skittering into the wet hay. Kalb dropped from the loft landing lightly. He kicked the gun away and stood over Crow, the pitchfork now leveled at his throat. Crow's men, hearing the commotion, rushed in, but stopped dead at the sight of their leader pinned and helpless. Crow writhed on the floor, clutching his injured shoulder, his face contorted with pain and rage. He glared up at Kalb, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You think this is about land," he snarled, spitting a mouthful of blood and rain onto the floor. "You think this is about some petty debt?" Lightning flashed, illuminating the hatred in his eyes. "My name is Wendell Crow. Does that mean nothing to you? Eleanor was my sister. My younger sister." The world stopped. Kalb could only stare, the pitchfork wavering in his hands. "That's right," Crow hissed, seeing the shock on Kalb's face. "She wrote to me, you know. Wrote about her handsome, charming husband, the one who was supposed to protect her. She never told you about me because our father disowned me. But she and I were close." His voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "I don't believe her death was an accident. I got the doctor's report before Patterson could bury it. It said you had liquor on your breath that night. It said you were reckless. You were drunk, weren't you, Kalb, drunk and careless with the most precious thing in the world? You didn't just let her die. You killed her." The accusation hit Kalb like a physical blow. It was a lie. He hadn't had a drink in a week before the accident. But Crow believed it. He had built his entire world, his entire revenge, on this terrible false foundation. The whipping, Kalb breathed, understanding dawning, was just the start. Crow spat. "I wanted you to know what it felt like to be worthless. I worked with Patterson to spread the rumor you were barren, to turn the town against you, to strip you of your dignity before I stripped you of everything else. I wanted to ruin you, Kalb, just like you ruined me when you took her." He struggled to sit up, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. "I'm not here for your land. I'm here for your life. A life for a life. That is the only debt that matters." The truth was finally out, more twisted and terrible than Kalb could have ever imagined. This was not about greed. It was about a brother's vengeful, misguided grief. And Kalb was standing at the very center of it. The revelation in the barn changed everything. Crow's men, unnerved by their leader's obsessive confession, and Kalb's sudden fierce defense of the homestead had dragged their injured boss away into the storm. But Kalb knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Crow's vendetta was now laid bare. It wasn't a problem that could be solved with a fence or a firearm. This battle had to be fought not on the homestead, but in the heart of the place where the lies began, Hollow Creek. Reeling from Crow's accusation, Kalb understood he could not win by force. Crow had twisted the law and the town's opinion into a weapon. To save his family, Kalb had to disarm him. He had to prove his innocence and expose the truth about the night Eleanor died. 2 days later, Kalb rode for Hollow Creek. Miriam had protested her fear for him a tangible thing. "You can't go back there," she'd pleaded. "They'll kill you. They'll kill us all if I don't." He had replied, his voice heavy with grim certainty. "I can't let a lie be the end of us." He left Levi in charge, the boy's shoulders squared with a responsibility far beyond his years. Entering Hollow Creek was like walking into his own grave. He kept to the back alleys, his hat pulled low, the stares of the few people who recognized him feeling like physical blows. The town that had whipped and cast him out now felt like a cage, and Crow was the keeper. His destination was the small chapel at the end of the main street. He needed to find Preacher Malcolm. Not just for moral support, but because Kalb now remembered a crucial detail from the night of the accident. Preacher Malcolm had been the first person on the scene. He had been riding his circuit and had found Kalb by the wreckage had helped him back to town. He was a witness. Kalb found the preacher tending the small withered garden behind the chapel. The old man looked up, his face etched with weariness and shame. He was not surprised to see Kalb. "I knew you would come back," Malcolm said, his voice raspy. "A man like you doesn't run from the truth. Then you know what Crow is saying is a lie." Kalb said, his tone accusatory. "You were there, Malcolm. You helped me. Did I have liquor on my breath?" The preacher couldn't meet his eyes. He turned away, his shoulders slumping. "No, son. You did not. You were dazed, broken, but you were sober. I smelled nothing but the rain and the mud on you." "Then why?" Kalb's voice cracked with a pain deeper than any lash. "Why did you stay silent when the doctor made his report, when the whole town condemned me? Why did you say nothing?" Malcolm finally turned back, and Kalb saw tears glistening in the old man's eyes. It was a crisis of faith made manifest. Because I was a coward, he confessed, the words tearing from him. Crow had just arrived in town. He was making donations to the church, promising a new roof, a new steeple. He spoke of piety and order, and he had Judge Patterson in his pocket. I saw the power he was gathering. I was afraid, Kalb. I told myself it was for the good of the flock to not make waves. I chose the safety of my church over the truth of one man, and I have lived with that sin every day since. The confession was a bitter pill, but it was also a glimmer of hope. Malcolm's guilt could be a powerful tool. The town doctor, Miller Kalb, pressed. He wrote the false report. He's the only other one who knows the truth. Miller is deep in Crow's debt, Malcolm said, shaking his head. Gambling losses. Crow owns him. He won't talk. Then we have to make him. Kalb said, a new resolve hardening in his voice. We have to force a confrontation. In public, where the entire town can see the lie for what it is. The preacher looked at Kalb, at the man who had every right to hate him, to strike him down for his cowardice. But in Kalb's eyes, he saw not vengeance, but a desperate fight for justice. In that moment, Preacher Malcolm found the courage he had misplaced years ago. What do you need me to do? He asked, his voice no longer weak, but filled with the fire of a man seeking his own redemption. The plan was simple and dangerously bold. With Malcolm's help, Kalb sent a message to Wendell Crow, a public meeting at the Hollow Creek Saloon at noon the next day. The subject, the final settlement of the debt on Miriam Carter's land. It was a direct challenge, a gamble that Crow's arrogance would compel him to accept, a public victory lap. As they'd hoped, Crow agreed immediately, eager to finalize his triumph in front of the entire town. Noon arrived with a suffocating tension. The saloon was crowded, packed with Crow's hired guns and nervous townsfolk drawn by the promise of drama. A storm mirroring the one from the night of the attack was gathering outside, casting the room in a gloomy, expectant light. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and fear. On the wall behind the bar, a large clock ticked with agonizing slowness, each click of the second hand, a hammer blow marking the time. Calb stood alone in the center of the room. Preacher Malcolm stood near the doorway, his Bible held tightly in his hands, his presence a silent testament. The saloon doors swung open, and Wendell Crow entered, flanked by two of his men. He moved with the unassailable confidence of a king entering his court. He was smiling. In one hand he held the deed to Miriam's land. He'd brought Dr. Miller with him, a pale, sweating man who looked like he was walking to his own execution. Mercer Crow boomed his voice, filling the room. "I'm glad you've decided to be sensible. A public settlement is fitting. Let the town see that justice is always served in Hollow Creek." He slapped the deed on a nearby table. "But first, a final piece of business. There have been whispers, questions about my motives. So let's clear the air." He gestured to the trembling doctor. "Dr. Miller was the physician who attended to Mr. Mercer on the night my dear sister was killed. Doctor, please tell the good people of this town what you found." All eyes turned to Miller. The doctor licked his dry lips, his gaze darting around the room, avoiding Calb's. "On the night of the accident," he began, his voice barely a croak, "Mr. Mercer was intoxicated." A murmur went through the crowd. It was the final nail in Calb's coffin, the public confirmation of the lie that had defined his ruin. But as the doctor was about to continue, the saloon doors opened again. A small figure stood silhouetted against the stormy daylight. It was Levi. The boy walked into the saloon, his face set with a determination that made him look twice his age. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood Miriam, her face a portrait of fierce love, with Ruthie and Nana clutching her skirts. Crow stared, momentarily thrown. "What is this?" Levi ignored him. He walked directly toward Calb, his eyes never leaving his stepfather's. In his hands, he held his family's large, leather-bound Bible. He stopped in front of Calb and held it up. "My mother found your old journal." Levi said, his voice clear and steady, ringing through the silent room. "The one from before. You wrote about the accident. You wrote that the carriage axle was faulty and that you begged her not to travel in the storm, but she insisted. My mother read it. And she made you swear on this Bible, our family's Bible, that every word of it was true." Levi turned, holding the heavy book aloft for the whole saloon to see. "He swore it. My father swore it. And my mother says a man who swears on this book does not lie." The boy's simple, unwavering declaration of faith was more powerful than any weapon. The symbolic weight of the Bible, of a child's trust, hung in the air. The townsfolk looked from the boy to the doctor, their expressions shifting from morbid curiosity to doubt. Dr. Miller broke. A sob escaped his lips. He sank onto a chair, burying his face in his hands. "It's not true," he wept. "He wasn't drunk. He was sober. Crow paid me. He paid off my gambling debts and promised me more if I falsified the report." The axle was clearly cracked. It was a tragic accident, nothing more. The confession sucked the air out of the room. Crow's face went from triumphant crimson to ashen white. His carefully constructed world of lies had been demolished by a child holding a Bible. Enraged, his composure shattered. Crow drew his gun. "Liar," he screamed, leveling the pistol at the doctor. But Calb was already moving. He lunged not at Crow but at the table, upending it and sending it crashing into Crow's legs. The gun went off the bullet, burying itself in the ceiling. The saloon erupted into chaos. Crow's men drew their weapons, but before they could fire, a new voice bellowed from the doorway. "Drop them." It was the town's new sheriff, a young, earnest man Kalb had spoken to only briefly. Inspired by the raw display of courage, he had chosen his side. He stood with his own pistol drawn, flanked by 2 armed citizens. The fight was short and brutal. Kalb didn't seek to kill Crow. His fight was to disarm, to subdue. He wrestled the gun from Crow's hand, his actions driven not by vengeance, but by a desperate need to end the cycle of violence. The townsfolk, finally seeing the truth, turned on Crow's men, overwhelming them. The climax ended not with a dramatic death, but with the quiet, satisfying click of handcuffs. Wendell Crow, the man who had ruled Hollow Creek through fear and deceit, knelt on the saloon floor, defeated and exposed before the very people he had manipulated. The storm outside finally broke, and rain began to wash the dust from the streets. In the aftermath of the saloon confrontation, a wave of shame washed over Hollow Creek. The truth once revealed was impossible to ignore. Judge Patterson was swiftly removed from his position, and the corrupt officials Crow had controlled were held accountable by the newly emboldened sheriff. The townsfolk one by one approached Kalb. They didn't offer grand apologies, but quiet, mumbled words of regret. The blacksmith offered to repair his tools for free. The general store owner pressed a sack of flour and sugar into Miriam's hands, his eyes downcast. They offered Kalb a seat on the new town council, a position of leadership. He politely refused. "I'm not a leader," he told the sheriff. "I'm a husband and a father. I just want to go home." Before leaving town, the sheriff handed Kalb a small, heavy object. It was the silver locket. It had been found among Crow's possessions. Kalb held it in his palm, and the metal cool against his skin. Its weight felt different now, no longer a burden of grief, but a relic of a past that had finally been put to rest. He didn't return to the homestead immediately. He walked alone to the small, windswept cemetery on the edge of town. He found Eleanor's grave, the simple wooden marker weathered by years of sun and rain. He had not visited it since the day of her funeral, the guilt too heavy to bear. He knelt in the damp earth, the locket held loosely in his fingers. He spoke to her, not in grand pronouncements, but in a quiet conversational tone, as if she were sitting right there with him. He told her about Miriam and the children. He told her about the lie he had lived under and the truth that had finally set him free. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to make you stay that night. And I'm sorry I let my guilt keep me from living." He paused, looking at the simple name carved into the wood. "I forgive myself for all of it." With a final symbolic act, he gently placed the silver locket on the earth at the base of the gravestone. He was letting her go, not from his memory, but from the prison of his grief. He was leaving the past here in this quiet ground, so he could fully embrace the future that was waiting for him. As he stood and walked away, he did not look back. His steps were light, his heart unburdened for the first time in years. Kalb's return to the homestead was quiet and profound. Miriam saw him coming from a long way off. She met him at the edge of the clearing, and without a word, he pulled her into his arms. The children ran to him, wrapping their arms around his legs. Levi stood back for a moment, then walked forward and clasped Kalb's hand, a gesture of respect and love that spoke volumes. The family was whole. The war was over. They were finally truly safe. Months later, the land was thriving. The autumn harvest was bountiful, and the cabin felt warm and secure against the coming winter. The story ends with a scene that reflects its beginning. Kalb is in the yard teaching Levi how to repair a cracked wheel on the very same wagon that had carried him broken and bleeding to this new life. The scars on his back are still there, a permanent map of his journey, but they no longer ache. They no longer define him. Miriam watches from the porch, a peaceful, genuine smile on her face. Nena sits at her feet, singing one of Ruthie's simple songs. Kalb catches Miriam's eye, and the look that passes between them is one of deep, abiding love. A love forged not in whispered promises, but in shared struggle and unwavering grace. As the sun begins to set, casting a warm, golden light over the valley, a lone rider approaches. For a moment the old tension returns, but the rider's posture is not threatening. He's a mail carrier from a neighboring territory, and he brings a letter. It isn't addressed to Kalb Mercer, but to the homesteader at Hollow Creek. Kalb opens it, his brow furrowed in curiosity. The letter is from a man in another territory, a man he has never met. Sir, it reads, I am writing to you because I heard the story of the barren man who inherited a family. They tell it around the campfires now. I too have been branded by my community. They say my land is cursed because I have no sons to work it. They are trying to force me out. I am writing to you because I have started to believe them. I wanted to ask, how did you find the strength not to? Kalb reads the letter aloud to Miriam. When he finishes, a heavy silence hangs between them. He looks at his wife, his own past reflected in this stranger's painful words. Miriam simply reaches out and places a hand on his arm, a gesture of silent, unwavering support. She nods. He looks from the letter to the faces of his family, at the home they have built, at the peace they have earned. His purpose, once so lost, is now crystal clear. It is not to lead a town or to hold a position of power. It is something quieter and far more important. Kalb walks into the cabin, picks up a pen and a clean sheet of paper, and begins to write back. His pain has found its purpose. He will offer hope to the broken and the cast aside, one soul at a time.